years, Luis has focused his reporting on Puerto Rico's debt crisis and fiscal crisis. He also contributed reporting to the Pandora Papers, the ICIJ investigation. Luis is going to tell us about a FOIA fight that has taken him all the way to the US Supreme Court and how the access to public records hangs in the balance. Unsurprisingly, major news organizations like Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, Mother Jones, the Institute for Nonprofit News, and the Center for Investigative Reporting have signed on to an amicus brief in support of Luis and CPI's case. So now here's Luis to tell us about his FOIA fight and how he got here. Take it away.
Okay. So first, I want to thank the organizers of this wonderful event for having us here. It's a really long flight from Puerto Rico to here, but totally worth it, so thank you. So CPI was founded 15 years ago. It is a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigative journalism in Puerto Rico. So whether it is federal recovery money for reconstruction after Hurricane Maria, or public education, climate change, corruption, or gender issues, we serve as watchdogs in holding power to account. El Centro also runs a journalism training institute and goes to court to obtain public documents. Our mission is to produce, promote, and defend investigative journalism and the public's right to access information. Next slide, please. CPI's work has played an important role in bringing about social change, accountability, recovery, and justice. One example of this is the Telegram Gate investigation, which included the revelation of 889 pages of misogynist Telegram messages showing blunt abuse of power between then Governor Ricardo Rosselló and 11 other administration officials and outsiders. The investigation gave way to massive social protests, as you can see, that ended with the resignation of the governor. So here's a little context about Puerto Rico. It is a territory of the United States, a colony. It's been that way since the US invaded the island in 1898. About 3 million people live on the island, while more than 5 million live on the US mainland. Puerto Ricans are born US citizens, but they do not vote for the US president. Puerto Rico does not have a single voting member in Congress and is treated differently under various federal programs such as Medicaid. There is profound poverty and inequality in Puerto Rico. About 44% of the island population live below the US poverty line. According to recent census data, the US national average is around 12%. And a lot of this has to do with almost 20 years of economic recession, massive outmigration, a debt crisis, and government bankruptcy process, unprecedented natural disasters such as earthquakes and Hurricane Maria, political turmoil, and a virtual federal takeover of Puerto Rico's public finances. Puerto Rico's sovereignty has always lied and still lies with the US Congress, which has absolute power over its territories. These powers precisely allowed Congress and the Obama administration to enact the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, PROMESA, which means promise in English. It was the US bipartisan solution to a deep fiscal crisis that brought the government to the brink of collapse. Puerto Rico was not able to pay its debt obligations while ensuring essential government services to citizens. Puerto Rico first tried to implement its own bankruptcy law, but the US Supreme Court struck it down in 2016 on constitutional grounds. And that is when Congress and the Obama administration came up with PROMESA. PROMESA has been implemented only in Puerto Rico, although the law may be applied to 4 other territories of the US, which are Guam, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the US Virgin Islands. So there are 2 main components of this law. First, it provides a debt restructuring process in federal court. The Puerto Rico government filed for bankruptcy in 2017. Almost 6 years later, and more than $1 billion in public funds going to lawyers and consultants only, Puerto Rico is still in this process. And second, and perhaps the most controversial part of this law, is the creation of this so-called oversight board, known locally as La Junta. It is formed by 7 voting members who are appointed by the US president from recommendations made by Democrats and Republicans. Yet Promesa makes the disclaimer that the board is not a federal government agency and it is funded by Puerto Rico taxpayers. So Puerto Rico Fiscal Oversight Board has broad powers over the government and consequently public policy. For instance, it acts as a legal guardian of the elected government in the debt restructuring court process that it's underway. The board can force the government to nullify laws and has already done so with laws involving pensions, health insurance, and workers' benefits. And last but not least important, it has a veto power and control over the entire government budget. Yet Puerto Ricans do not vote for its members nor any of the people involved in their appointment. So as you can imagine, the board became a priority quickly in terms of coverage at CPI, precisely because of the impact of its decisions in Puerto Ricans' daily lives and the undemocratic nature of its existence. Its relationship with the elected government has also brought serious governance issues. We have done a lot of work about the board, its members, operations, decisions, and how these affect pensioners, teachers, schools, healthcare, the recovery process, and economic development on the island. In 2017, we sued the board to access a range of documents that we firmly believe are public records. We did it under Puerto Rico's constitutional right of access to information, the same way we have done so many times with Puerto Rico government agencies. CPI requested documents such as communications between the board and the federal government, internal governance rules, financial disclosures, and conflict of interest documents, among others. The board refused to give these documents, saying it was not subject to Puerto Rico access to information right. It says that it is immune from being sued for this. 1 year later, the district court in Puerto Rico decided in favor of CPI. In 2018, the board began to give us documents. We received more than 18,000 documents. Most of these were emails like these, and you could go to the other, which are communications between board members and officials from the federal government and Congress. The board did withhold about 22,000 other documents, arguing that their disclosure would affect the island's economy, capital markets, pending law enforcement investigations, and I quote, the ability to perform its statutory duties. We did reporting on the documents that we received, showing the boundless influence, for example, of the federal government and Congress over the board's operations. And remember, the law says that it is not a federal entity, and how some advisors were running the board's operations, such as McKinsey & Company, one of its lead consultants. So right about the same time we put out these stories, guess what? The board stopped sharing documents and appealed the decision. So the board has been arguing all along since they appealed the decision that it is protected from CPI's claim because it has this so-called sovereign immunity, a complicated constitutional concept that basically means that a government, and in this case the board, cannot be sued without its consent. The First Circuit Court, and you could, next slide. The First Circuit Court, in a divided decision, decided against the board's argument. The board went to the Supreme Court, and the court took the case. CPI's argument is that sovereign immunity belongs to states, and territories are not states. The board's entire existence, not to mention the vast powers it can exert over the more than 3 million people who live in Puerto Rico, is only because Puerto Rico's colonial status. The oral argument was held in January, and we continue to await a decision before June. Some bets are on next week's decisions, so let's see what happens there. It's been a long and tough road for us. When the case began, we were a small newsroom with only 7 journalists and very limited resources. The fact that we're still there fighting for this against a board and its unlimited legal resources is something that we feel very proud of, no matter what the outcome is. And this case also shows that whether it is a local government agency or this mighty board, we will not give up on our quest to scrutinize power and access information that we believe to be public. Next slide. And why it matters? Well, because there's a lot at stake for Puerto Rico, but also for other territories and investigative journalism in general. The board strategically turned the case to Puerto Rico's sovereignty, a very debated issue both on the island and in Washington. But besides this complicated legal debate, the case is critical for journalism in Puerto Rico. The board is such a powerful entity, you could argue it's the de facto government, and oversight of its decisions will be severely affected if they are allowed to decide when and to whom they release public documents without being subject to Puerto Rico Freedom of Information Law. And for media elsewhere, it is in the best interest of First Amendment rights and freedom of information that the courts decides in favor of CBI. We firmly believe courts should facilitate access to public records and assure government accountability, not the other way around. As the Reporters Committee stated in their brief supporting CBI, and I quote, "Access to information about the activities and expenditures of government bodies, including the board, is essential to informing the public, fostering discourse, and maintaining a necessary check on government power." It is important to remember that PROMESA not only applies to Puerto Rico, as I said, but also to other territories. And there's also the idea of it being a blueprint for future bankruptcy at the municipal and state level in the US. For those of you who don't know, you could go to the next slide. And this was something that CBI investigated back in 2017. This type of government-created fiscal entities, similar to Puerto Rico's board, have already been expanding in cities and counties throughout the US. So imagine how this court decision could set a precedent for allowing these entities, with all the powers they usually have, to avoid being subject to scrutiny and freedom of information laws. So this is it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis. Good luck with your case. We're all rooting for you, obviously.